The sum of the square roots of any two sides of an isosceles triangle is equal to the square root of the remaining side.
That's a right triangle, you idiot! Go!
The Pythagorean theorem is one of the most ubiquitous lessons middle schoolers in the United States and early adolescents around the world learn. Given a right triangle, if you add the squares of the lengths of the two legs of that triangle, you'll get the square of the length of the hypotenuse. The theorem usually introduces the concept of Euclidean geometry to those that learn it, and the numerous proofs of it exemplify the converging roots of writing proofs at its most fundamental level. Outside of the realm of math, Pythagoras' name is probably one of the most recognizable, so quantitatively, let's compare his breadth of contribution with the contributions of other famous mathematicians. Euclid, most well known as the father of his eponymous Euclidean geometry, authored the Elements, by far the most successful anthology of math books of all time, only being surpassed by the Bible in number of print copies made. The 13 books spanned everything from his geometry to elementary number theory and algebra. Leonhard Euler wrote over 500 papers ranging from the formalization of calculus to the creation of graph theory. Carl Friedrich Gauss, the so-called Princeps Mathematicorum, made contributions including proving the fundamental theorem of algebra and exploring non-Euclidean geometry. Pythagoras, on the other hand, had zero surviving publications or records of making any progress in the field of math as a whole. So what about the Pythagorean theorem? That's a bit trickier. Most modern results can be attributed to one or at most a few mathematicians. We all agree that calculus is the result of Newton and Leibniz. We all agree that Fermat's last theorem was proven by Andrew Wiles. However, the Pythagorean theorem developed in different parts of the world independently. Why Pythagoras gets the namesake is the allegation that he's responsible for its first proof. Side note, proofs of the Pythagorean theorem come in a lot of varieties. The first examples of these proofs popped up in China, Mesopotamia, and India, and evidence of Babylonian use of the theorem exists, but the first recorded version of the proof occurred in Euclid's Elements. The proof was pretty cumbersome, but since then, more than 350 proofs have been shown to be valid for the theorem. Perhaps the most elegant proof is this proof, a visual proof, which shows the result through the simplicity of the two diagrams. Simply rearranging four triangles within a bigger square shows that this empty space is equal to this empty space. In 45 BCE, more than 4.5 centuries after the death of Pythagoras, we have the first recorded connection between Pythagoras and his right triangle theorem. Cicero, consul of Rome, wrote about a rumor that Pythagoras was the author of the proof, yet he himself expressed doubt about it on the basis of what we do know about Pythagoras the mystic. Cicero's doubt at Pythagoras' discovery is pretty indicative of the kind of guy Pythagoras was. We don't know much at all about him as a mathematician, but we do know that Pythagoras was an important man in another field. The cult of Pythagoras has come to describe the loving communities he established on the Ionian coast of Italy and the practices that the inhabitants followed. To address the concerns of Cicero, we believe Pythagoras, and what was one of his most tame beliefs, practiced vegetarianism. Needless to say, it would be implausible that the myth that Pythagoras proved his theorem and went to sacrifice an ox for it would be true. In fact, Pythagoras abstained from sacrifices to the gods in general, except of course for inanimate sacrifices to Apollo at a local altar. Vegetarianism was an important marker of belief and hierarchy in his communities. Those that were the closest to his belief were expected to live simply, which meant abstaining from meat, that which was seen as impure.
What's the matter? Scared of beans?
The Pythagorean rejection of the consumption of beans is still speculated about to this day, especially given that it seems so natural to consume given Pythagorean vegetarianism. Yet there are hypotheses as to why the legume was rejected. Some historians believe that the Pythagorean belief in the transmigration of souls into animals seemed to apply to beans as their fleshy texture mirrored that of a meat. Aristotle postulated that it wasn't the personification of the beans, but rather the bean's shape, which symbolized the universe, as the cause of Pythagoras' aversion. However, Pythagoras didn't fear the fava bean, he seemed to obsess over them. Most accounts agree that, in the wake of a riot against Pythagoras, his house was caught on fire. He would have narrowly escaped assassination, yet he ran into a field of fava beans. He chose to protect the field rather than his own life. Bertrand Russell, philosopher and mathematician, would note the abstinence from beans as the first peculiar rule of the Pythagorean order. Among these rules were also not to pick up what was fallen, not to break bread, eat from a whole loaf, and to roll one's bedclothes together and smooth out the impress of the body when awakening. Well, what does math have to do with any of this? Although we don't know of Pythagoras the mathematician, we can describe him as a worshipper of numbers. Famously, Pythagoras had been quoted as expressing that all things are numbers, but the extent to which this was applied in Pythagorean life is exemplified best by his beliefs about the number 10. The tetractys was seen as the pinnacle of a divine geometry discovered by the Pythagoreans. Of course, most importantly was the incrementation of rows from 1 to 4. The number 10, as the sum of this series, took on a sacredness. Not only did the shape also represent the 4 basic elements, but also took on the concepts of increasing geometric dimension. First we have a point in 0 dimensions, then a line, a plane represented by a triangle, and finally a tetrahedron, representing 3 dimensions. More than 2 millennia later, mathematician William Rowan Hamilton would refer to Pythagoras in a sonnet called the Tetractys. Now that we've established Pythagoras and his followers as worshippers of number, let's return to that famous theorem. Hippasus was a follower of Pythagoras and a mathematician among the group. The Pythagoreans were already well aware of triples like 3, 4, and 5, but in an effort to make an abstraction, Hippasus sought to figure out how long a hypotenuse would be on a triangle where the lengths of the initial sides were 1. Hippasus recognized that there was something pretty peculiar about the number. It certainly wasn't an integer, but also it couldn't be expressed as a ratio of integers. Below, I've linked a video by Vsauce which explains the proof for this, called Proof by Infinite Descent, but in lieu of the details, let's examine the Pythagorean reaction to the discovery. It's alleged that the Pythagoreans, in a fit of hubris over the idea of the completeness of rational numbers, retaliated by tossing the man to his death in the sea. Accounts of this may vary, and the embellishment of the tales surrounding Pythagoras' overzealousness warps the base incident, but the plausibility of the tale, even being recanted by the late Stephen Hawking, is nothing but a testament to the cultic practices of the followers of Pythagoras. The face of mathematics, that which perhaps a century ago would have been Euclid's geometer, came to fame due to the unlikely false attribution to an ancient man of an even more ancient proof. Those that praise numbers are not equivalent to those that study them, despite overlap thereof. Does this discount Pythagoras as a poster child? Perhaps. The impact of this man's cult reverberates through the field through the advancements made by his followers. Until next time, guys.